Hello there, the name's Clark, and welcome to my very first devlog. Last summer, I dove headfirst and gave Unity a whirl. I used my week in between my end of session and my start of summer session to make a 2D shooter game inspired by one of my favorite games of all time, The Binding of Isaac. If you're familiar with the indie scene, you're probably familiar with Isaac. But in case you're not, it's a 2D procedurally generated dungeon crawler where Isaac, the protagonist, hides away from his radically religious mother that wishes to kill him for his sins. Yes, it may seem somber, and it's even more somber when you realize the basement that Isaac escapes to is just a representation of his own psyche as he crumbles in onto himself. But I digress. Apart from the complex lore, The Binding of Isaac really shines in its replayability with its extensive item unlock system and item synergies. Runs can really get out of hand with the right combinations. Really out of hand. This brings me to what I made. For lack of imagination, I was simply seeing if I could make a reskinned Binding of Isaac type game. I made all the pixel art assets for the player and enemies and implemented them into the game. I was pretty satisfied with what I had accomplished within a week, and I encountered a few hilarious bugs along the way. But most of all, I learned a lot of the basics. A couple months ago, I buckled down and finally learned how to touch type. Hands down one of my best life decisions. But I may not have stuck with it if it weren't for the games. Games of a genre I was completely oblivious to. Indie typing games. The Texorcist is a game where you spew Latin passages to exorcise demons as you evade the onslaught of enemy projectiles. The graphics and design are beautiful. My only gripe with the game is the movement. Going from home row typing to shift WASD and then back to home row does not feel natural. In comes Nanotale Typing Chronicles. A combat system done right. The enemies have only a single word over their heads, which allows the use of the spacebar to switch between a typing mode and a movement mode. This felt a lot better. However, I can get bored of story games pretty easily, and the puzzles through which you unlock the new areas did not give me enough variety to keep me hooked. That being said, the visuals are stunning, and if you're into peaceful exploration with little spouts of combat, you may enjoy this title. This brings me to the final one I'm going to bring up, Z-Typer, a free browser game that does one thing that the other two did not so well. Impact. Destroying the ships feels good. Writing the words above the ships is worth the payout of the explosions, with the bigger motherships having bigger words and bigger explosions. And now having found what works and what doesn't, let me explain the idea for this devlog. So, I want to create a single screen, top-down view zombie shooter game with increasingly difficult waves of zombies. Picture this. You are the Last Typist, a member of a special force in the military that was armed with extremely high-tech sniper rifles. A gun that aims at your enemies using the split keyboard on either side. You are stranded on a field near your personal base of operations. Every night, you must fight off hordes of zombies by typing the words above their heads. Now, what's really getting me excited about this concept is the base building aspect that I plan to implement. Once the wave finishes, you'll be able to enter what I have called the meat grinder. While sitting on the meat grinder, new words will appear over the zombie corpses, which, when typed, will suck them up and grind them down into materials. The main materials will be flesh and cloth, that is produced from the clothes and body parts of said zombies. New crafting system. With cloth and flesh, you'll be able to make flesh bags. For all intents and purposes, these will work as sandbags, which will be used to construct walls, allowing you to start building a base and making it so enemies have to pathfind around these new obstacles to get to you. I also plan on implementing metal and explosive material, perhaps harvested from armored and bomber zombies. These materials will be used to make triggerable traps, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Now the actual development must begin. Not quite. Let's get a few sprites ready. I really wanted to get a feel for the art style and have at least a temporary sprite to put on my scene. So I started with pixel art, a familiar medium for my game sprite endeavors. I soon decided that I wanted the gun to rotate and not be bound to the pixel grid. This led me to splitting our poor soldier in half so I could rotate the gun and not make it look weird. It looked weird. I wasn't at all happy with the character. Simply put, it lacked an art style. Having not pigeonholed myself into a medium yet, I decided to try make the main character and his gun on Illustrator. One of the reasons I put game dev off during school is that I was spending a lot of my free time learning graphic design, especially vector art with Illustrator, so this was second nature. I went through several iterations of gun designs, and yes, my brain completely forgot that a keyboard had 3 rows. Thankfully, the hand could be hiding the bottom row, so I don't feel like I need to go back and change it just yet. I soon realized that what I liked the most about the initial sketch was the bulk of the gun compared to the character, so I added a circuit board design to give it some bulk. This was looking a lot more like the direction I wanted to go with the art. Next, I made a zombie. I was really starting to like the idea of keeping a geometric art style for the sprites, so I made the whole zombie out of shapes. I'm actually really happy with how it turned out, and I think I might continue in this style. Finally, I started the project. I made a basic player class where I allowed the player to switch in between 2 modes by pressing the spacebar, combat mode and movement mode. Next, I implemented the basic zombie class. At this point, I had so many ideas and variables bouncing around in my head that it was hard to figure out how I wanted to start implementing everything. It was time for a plan. I started sketching out my classes. I figured out I would want an abstract parent class, targetable, so that the player script could search through all the targetable objects on the scene. In our case, the targetable objects are all objects on the scene which have a word on top of them. I then subdivided my targetable class into 3 more abstract subclasses: enemies, traps, and corpses. I'm still unsure how I want to implement corpses since they will be exclusively targetable when using the meat grinder, but I decided to include them here for now so I don't forget them. I also sketched out an interactable parent class that would take care of all the interactable objects, such as the meat grinder. I added a bed thinking perhaps the player could sleep through the day to get to the next wave. Also, a nuclear typewriter came to mind, so added it there. Then I sketched out a possible action skill system with 2 offensive and defensive skills. For offense, I thought I could implement some piercing and explosive bullets dealing their respective AoE damage, and for defense, I thought perhaps force field and
almighty push.
But getting back to reality and to what should be done first, I decided I would need a class that would handle providing the random words that I appropriately named Word Vomit. After a restful sleep, I woke up and worked on Word Vomit. I found a text file list of all English words online. Word Vomit needs to return a random word of the appropriate length. So, for simplicity, I would preferably need to separate the words by length and put them in their respective files. So, I made a small Python script to do so. Started instantiating the files for every length. That's when I learned that the longest word in the English language is a type of lung disease and is 42 bloody characters long. That's when I decided I would have my boss battles be the 10 longest words in the English language, and I would have the zombie bosses steamed off the meaning of the words. So I stored that thought for later and continued coding. Long story short, I got lazy and only generated the first 10 text files. 1 to 10 letter words will be good for now. I'll come back later and edit the script if I need more. I wrote the Word Vomit class so that it would return a random word of the length path to its method. I then proceeded to implement the targetable hierarchy with its subclasses, making sure to declare the common attributes and methods in the abstract classes. I don't have any enemy-specific methods as of yet, and only a health variable, but I'm sure that once I create another enemy subclass, the commonalities between that one and the basic zombie will become clear, and hence what should be moved up to the parent class. After having made both the zombie and the player instantiate text about themselves, I made the player text dynamically editable so that the player can type in combat mode. As per plan, I then made my player class iterate through the targetable objects on the scene, to see if they can find a match in between what the player has typed and the target words atop the zombies. Once it did, I simply destroyed the respective zombie object. I then had to implement a partial matching system so that it would check if what is currently typed matches the substring found at the beginning of the words. I did this so that the player could target the zombie as soon as he starts to write the word that matches. I showed this visually by taking advantage of the rich text setting that allows markup tags to be used in the string of text set to the text element. I simply substringed the text and inserted the tags at the right intervals to change the text color. It was now time to work on the aim. And this is why you should read documentation. But this is also why you shouldn't read documentation. Trial and error can be a lot more fun. After having resolved that issue, I spent an hour and a half trying to figure out how to change the pivot point of an object. I needed the gun to pivot around the back hand, not the center of the gun sprite. The only way I found to do this was to give my gun object an empty parent and offsetting the gun object so that the needed pivot point lined up with the pivot point of the parent. I then proceeded by rotating the parent object, effectively rotating the gun around the desired pivot point. I added some 2D collider components to the zombies and some basic movement that makes a zombie move towards the player by extrapolating the vector in between them, and ended up with this. And look at that, it's slowly coming together. If you're interested to see where things go from here, hit that subscribe button. I'll try post every week or so. So, I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.